He's a big deal now, the founder of Panera Bread, but back when he was in college, he was just Ron Shaich, some teen getting kicked out of stores.
I was tossed out of a local convenience store.
Wait, you got kicked out of a convenience store in college?
Yes.
What did you do?
They accused us of shoplifting. I did nothing.
Are you sure?
I am positive.
Okay. Ron Shaich vowed to never go back to this store.
And I said, why don't we open our own nonprofit convenience store? If they don't appreciate our business, let's do our own.
Ron was 19 years old when he opened this store on his college campus.
What did you sell?
We sold everything you might want on a college campus. Crackers and snacks, the beverages, cleaning supplies.
Ron was good at opening stores. He went on to build this little cafe called Obampan into a big chain. And out of that came another big chain called Panera Bread.
There are more than 2,000 Paneras now. And, Ron's a good guy. He's the kind of guy who takes his kids to volunteer at food banks on the weekend.
And while they're all volunteering, he starts thinking that food pantries are actually really inefficient. He might as well just write a check, he thought.
And then one night, he's watching the news. It was actually a rerun of the NBC Nightly News, he said. And they had this story about this cafe in Denver called SAME, short for So All May Eat, that allows customers to pay what they want.
There's the menu with no prices, and the customers, those with and those without.
At Same Cafe, it didn't matter if you had money to pay for your meal.
And Ron's thinking, this sounds great. I can do something like this.
I said, we open a cafe every 2 days. We have more equipment, more resources, more capabilities. This is something we could do.
He thinks Panera can do this faster, bigger, and better. Private sector efficiency.
And this is the moment he decides he'll open nonprofit versions of Paneras. They'd look and taste like any other, but customers can decide what they want to pay.
I fundamentally believe that there were enough good people in the world that they would do the right thing. But I particularly loved torturing the cynics who were arguing, no way this would work. Everybody, it would be lunch on Uncle Ron.
Ron was making a big bet, not just on the business, but on human nature, that wealthy people and poor people would want to sit side by side for lunch, and that people would be so generous that these restaurants would break even.
And a professor who really knows consumers was watching all this with a lot of interest. What was your first impression of the idea?
My first impression of the idea was, this will never work.
Hello and welcome to Planet Money. I'm Sarah Gonzalez.
And I'm Dan Bobkoff.
Dan is with us from the podcast Household Name. They tell stories about how brands affect our lives.
Today on the show, an experiment in charity that goes right to the heart of human nature.
The relationship between what we believe in and what we will actually spend money on.
It's a story about homelessness,
broccoli cheddar soup,
and the war between good and evil that rages within every consumer.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Vistaprint, who want you to own the now with up-to-date, truly custom marketing. Small business owners know the difference between seeing an opportunity and seizing an opportunity is looking totally professional in the moment. And that moment starts with making an unforgettable first impression. Right now, NPR listeners can go to Vistaprint.com and get up to 50% off all business cards. Just go to Vistaprint.com, promo code PLANET.
Paneras are kind of like fancier fast food. They're a little healthier and a little pricier.
And when Ron said he was going to let customers pay whatever they wanted for Panera food, he decided these special cafes needed to be in areas where there were enough poorer people who could benefit from the generosity of enough wealthier people.
Our whole idea here was not simply to create another homeless shelter or another soup kitchen. It was actually to have a real meal, and a real meal with dignity.
So he creates a nonprofit arm called Panera Cares. Instead of cash registers, the Cares cafes have donation bins. All the prices on the menu are just suggested prices.
To give customers some idea of how much food actually costs. And the whole idea and hope here is that enough wealthier customers will pay more than the suggested price so the needy can eat for less.
The first location opened in Clayton, Missouri, near St. Louis in 2010. Ron actually stepped down as CEO to get it off the ground.
I can remember that first day we opened the cafe. I waited on customers. I waited behind the counter. I worked 100 hours that next week in the cafe.
Ron then opens more nonprofit Paneras in Chicago, Boston, Portland, Oregon, and Dearborn, Michigan, right outside Detroit. I was a reporter in the area then, and I remember thinking, hunger's such a big problem. Maybe this could actually help.
No big restaurant corporation had ever tried this. And there was one professor who studies consumer behavior and consumer ethics who was thinking, what Ron is proposing goes against everything I know about how consumers behave. What is the most depressing thing you've learned in studying consumer ethics?
Oh my gosh, that's wow. There's a deep well to pull from.
Oh no.
Gianna Eckhart is a professor of marketing at Royal Holloway University of London.
Well, I'll answer that by telling you the title of my most recent book on this topic, which is called The Myth of the Ethical Consumer.
Yep. There are no ethical consumers. Gianna says how people feel about a social issue like hunger and how they behave in the marketplace are two totally different things. Meaning, like, I can hate sweatshops, but I might still buy a pair of tennis shoes from a brand that uses sweatshop labor.
Exactly.
So she's like, I have to follow Ron's experiment. She actually observes these cafes for years.
These Panera Cares cafes got going quick. Soon they were serving 4,000 people a week.
And of course, there were a few early problems. Like Ron had designed these big signs that explained the model, the menu, the mission.
We put so much energy into building these signs to tell people to do the right thing, pay what you want, pay what you can, pay it forward.
But apparently people don't read signs. Everyone was confused. Like, what do you mean suggested prices? So now they had to spend money to hire someone who could stand at the door and explain how this whole thing works. But whatever, like, they were serving the needy. This is what Ron wanted.
And you know, there's a certain kind of person who's going to show up when you do something like this, like those kids who take the whole bowl of Halloween candy. Yeah, they showed up.
I can literally remember couple of kids, local kids, walked into our store in Clayton, Missouri, and they walked up to the counter kind of laughing, and they said, I'll have 3 smoothies and 2 roast beef sandwiches, and here's my dad's credit card, put $3 on it. And I just wanted to jump over that counter, and I wanted to grab the kid around the neck and whack him. And I just wanted to say, don't you get it? Right? Somebody else has got to pay.
Ron had to keep battling people's bad impulses, even his own staff. They started judging people, profiling them.
People would walk in and we would assume we knew, either based on how they looked, based on how they were dressed, potentially based on the color of their skin, what they were going to do.
The staff would be like, wait, how much did you put in the bin? You look like you could give a bit more. He ended up putting the staff through sensitivity training. But he's really happy with the experiment at this point.
About 6 months in, Ron says more than half of the customers were paying the suggested price. About 20% paid extra, and the other 20% paid less. Sometimes they paid nothing at all.
Hey, free soup.
Which overall sounds pretty great. But what Gianna is seeing sitting there on all her visits looks a little different.
At the beginning, people who were homeless were bringing in every possession that they owned into the Panera, which was typically in like a shopping cart. That's how they would keep their possessions. And so you would see all of these shopping carts around, which also smelled in addition to the people themselves. So the managers had to come up with rules about the size of bags that you could bring in and things like that to manage that situation.
It fell on employees in these cafes to deal with issues that they weren't really qualified for, like mental health and drug issues. Sharon Davis worked at the Portland store.
I was probably one of the oldest people there, so it was kind of like Grandma Sharon type of thing.
Grandma Sharon saw the best and worst of people.
There was a customer sitting there, and she comes up and she goes, oh my God, these people stink. I can't stand eating like this. And they said, well, I'm really sorry, but they are entitled to a meal. And you try to be very, very graceful about it.
And the bathrooms in particular were a big draw. Customers were doing things in there that Grandma Sharon should not have seen.
There'd be quite a few of them that were shooting up in there. When they'd come out the door, they were loaded, and we'd open the door and look, and there's blood everywhere. So then we'd have to close that bathroom.
Sharon says they were trying to do their best. They would refer customers to rehab and shelters and jobs and things like that.
But this experiment was really about food. And employees like Sharon told us the real problem was that these cafes weren't attracting enough generous people who wanted to pay more. So pretty early on, Panera's Cafe started telling customers that if they didn't have money to pay, they could volunteer for an hour in exchange for a meal, clean under the counters. The first store was in business for 8 years, but then it closed.
So did the ones in Dearborn, Chicago, and Portland.
Panera says it did not make financial sense to continue to operate Panera Cares. They're no longer trying to beat food banks at their own game. Panera is back to donating to them, writing checks.